I stood on my porch in the damp night air, listening to the metallic clinking of halyards against sailboat masts down at the marina. My hand rested on the edge of the wooden railing, right near the spot where I used to sit with my late husband when the business was nothing more than a rusted tool trailer and a big dream. People in this town see me now in my grease-stained coveralls and faded ball cap, with a noticeable limp in my right knee from a rogue winch back in '94, and they assume I am just an old woman who fixes outboard motors. They have no idea what it actually takes to build a commercial repair shop from the ground up, nor do they understand what 40 years of watching people run up unpaid tabs teaches you about human nature. My cell phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter behind me, breaking the quiet hush of the evening. Very few people have my direct personal number, and one of those people is Roy, a former Harbor Patrol sergeant who has run my main shop floor with absolute loyalty for nearly 2 decades. I stepped inside and pressed the phone to my ear, already knowing what he was about to say before he even opened his mouth. Roy did not say hello or waste time with pleasantries. His voice was low, taut, and tight with anxiety as he told me that my daughter-in-law had just pulled up to the North Storage facility. She was not alone. She had brought a local locksmith and a guy driving a massive flatbed tow truck, and she was standing under the security light waving a stack of official-looking papers at anyone who tried to look her way. I took a slow, deliberate breath and leaned my hand against the kitchen counter, right next to the small brass picture frame holding a photograph of my late husband. "Arthur?" I asked Roy if my son was with her, and Roy confirmed that she was entirely on her own with the hired help. She was demanding access to the building and threatening to bring down the law on anyone who got in her way. Roy hesitated, his tone rising in pitch as he asked if he should call the local police or physically block the flatbed from entering the yard. I told him, absolutely not. I told him to pull the night shift crew back from that side of the property, let the locksmith cut every single chain on the doors, and allow her to walk right through the front entrance completely unhindered. Tonight was the night she was finally going to walk straight into the cage she had been building for herself over the past 3 months. To understand how my daughter-in-law ended up standing outside my private storage facility with a hired locksmith at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, you have to go back 3 months to the exact moment I felt the first cold prickle of warning crawl up my spine. My son, Leo, is 34 years old, and he is as gentle and trusting as his father used to be. He runs the customer service side of our marine business, the part where you smile at boat owners, hand them hot coffee, and explain why an engine overhaul costs what it costs. When Arthur passed away 4 years ago, I stood beside his grave and swore an oath to keep a sharp eye on our boy, mostly because Leo has never once in his life believed that someone he loved could be capable of cold calculation. A year and a half ago, Leo married a woman named Brenda. Brenda claims to be an independent corporate brand strategist, which, as far as I can tell, means she spends her days in front of a ring light recording short videos about wealth attraction for her 40,000 internet followers. She never had 2 dimes to rub together before she met my son, but the moment they got hitched, she suddenly developed very loud opinions about our family business assets. It all came to a head during their anniversary dinner at a steakhouse downtown. I was sitting there in my one clean blazer, content just watching my son hold her hand. When Brenda set her wine glass down with a heavy thud, she looked across the table with that polished, perfect camera smile she always uses and casually asked me about the large North Storage building down past the fuel dock. I paused with my fork halfway to my mouth, keeping my expression completely blank while every inner alarm I possessed started screaming at once. I had never discussed the details of that building with Brenda, and I had barely ever mentioned it to Leo. From the outside, it was just an old, corrugated steel structure with rusted siding and heavy padlock chains sitting on a piece of waterfront, land that was not zoned for commercial retail. There was no legitimate reason on earth for a young woman who sells online beauty advice to even know that facility existed, let alone ask about its land value over dinner. I lowered my fork and kept my tone as casual as a Sunday morning. telling her it was just an old maintenance shed full of spare engine parts and dust. Brenda let out a high-pitched, airy laugh and leaned back in her chair, remarking that it seemed like a massive waste of prime waterfront property for a simple junk closet. She leaned in closer, her eyes sharpening with a sudden, hungry intensity, and asked if I had ever considered selling the parcel off to private land developers who would pay millions for the location. I turned my gaze toward my son, who was beaming at his wife like she had just solved world hunger, completely oblivious to the calculated glint in her eyes. I paid the heavy restaurant tab myself that night, just like I always do, because Brenda has never once offered to reach for her purse on the dark drive back to my house. I thought about the hard years Arthur and I spent sleeping in the back of an old pickup truck just to keep this business afloat. And I resolved right then that I would not let some greedy opportunist strip my son of his future. The very next morning at 9 o'clock sharp, the heavy brass knocker on my front door rattled. I opened it to find Leo standing on the porch holding 2 cardboard coffee cups, while Brenda stood beside him, clutching a sleek black leather folder like she was preparing to pitch a deal to a room full of corporate executives. My son was practically glowing with pride as he told me that Brenda had stayed up half the night putting together an extraordinary financial proposal for the family business. I brought them inside, poured fresh coffee into mugs, and sat down at the kitchen table as Brenda unrolled a series of glossy pie charts, tax assessments, and aerial photographs with a bright red circle drawn directly around our North Storage building. Brenda leaned forward, her voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy, and told me that I was practically bleeding money by holding on to that empty shed. She pointed at the property tax figures and insisted that, at my age, I ought to be traveling and enjoying my golden years rather than carrying dead weight on the waterfront. She claimed she had high-level developer contacts ready to buy the property for cash with zero hassle, offering to handle every scrap of paperwork herself so I would not have to lift a single finger. Leo nodded, right along with her pitch, urging me to let Brenda handle the burden so I could finally relax. I flipped slowly through her glossy pages, pretending to be an old woman overwhelmed by big numbers, letting her believe her sales pitch was working flawlessly. She had obviously dug through the public tax assessor records to pull those numbers, but what she did not realize was that public real estate records tell you absolutely nothing about what is actually taking place inside a building. I closed the folder, tapped my fingers on the leather cover, and told her in a soft voice that it was a lot of information to process all at once. I mentioned that I made it a strict rule never to sign a legal document on the same day I first read it, asking for a week to sit with the idea. I caught the tiny, barely perceptible twitch in her jaw before her flawless smile snapped back into place as I walked them out to the front porch. I noticed Brenda's eyes darting toward the hallway linen closet where I keep an old fireproof filing cabinet. She stared at that handle 2 seconds longer than anyone had reason to, and those 2 seconds gave me everything I needed to know. I spent the entire Sunday morning sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, replaying that sharp, predatory look in Brenda's eyes. People driven by pure greed simply cannot hide their true nature once they catch the scent of easy money. I knew that if I confronted her directly, without solid proof, Leo would blindly jump to her defense, and I would instantly become the paranoid, overbearing mother-in-law trying to destroy his happiness. I needed to let her think she was winning so her own impatience would drive her to make a fatal mistake in front of my son. I called Roy that afternoon and instructed him to pull the original title papers and basic tax documents for the North Building, making sure to leave out any mention of our long-term Harbor Authority contracts, creating the deliberate illusion of an empty, forgotten storage unit. 2 full weeks of silence followed, during which I deliberately ignored her hint, dropping text messages and avoided her calls, allowing her desperation to simmer in the background. The first visible crack in her facade appeared on a bright Tuesday morning outside the small bait-and-tackle shop my son had built with 3 years of his own hard-earned savings. I was walking down the sidewalk carrying 2 hot coffees when I saw a commercial tow truck backed straight up to Leo's delivery van, its hydraulic lift already grinding as it hoisted the front wheels off the pavement. My son was standing on the curb, his face completely drained of color, holding his phone while the tow driver paid no attention to his frantic explanations. When Leo saw me, his voice cracked with humiliation as he explained that the bank was repaying the van for 3 consecutive months of missed lease payments. He kept repeating that it had to be a massive system error because Brenda handled all the business accounts and had set up automatic payments months ago. Before I could pull out my checkbook, tires screeched behind us as Brenda's lease luxury sedan pulled into the lot. She sprang out of the car with her hair unwashed and her makeup smudged, looking nothing like the pristine influencer who posted daily videos about effortless financial abundance. She marched up to the driver and screamed at him to put the vehicle down immediately, claiming it was a major bank glitch. The driver crossed his arms and coldly informed her that the recovery order was 90 days overdue, because every single electronic payment had bounced due to insufficient funds. I watched Brenda's hands shake violently as she dialed her phone, pacing in frantic little circles while whispering frantically about security flags and transfer delays. After 10 agonizing minutes, she handed her phone to the driver, and whatever voice spoke to him on the line convinced him to grant a temporary 30-day hold. The van was lowered back to the pavement, and Leo wrapped his arms around her in deep relief, assuring her that everything was fine. But as my son held her, Brenda looked directly over his shoulder, and for one brief moment her mask dropped entirely, revealing an expression of raw, icy terror. A woman running a prosperous 6-figure online consulting firm does not lose her mind over a temporary banking glitch, nor does she shake like a leaf in an alleyway over a routine bill. My suspicions turned into absolute certainty right then and there. Brenda was drowning in massive personal debt, and she had been quietly draining my son's small business accounts to keep her head above water while searching for a massive payout to clear her slate. That massive payout, as I now fully understood, was the waterfront property she thought I was sitting on. That very Friday, the two of them showed up on my doorstep with overnight bags, claiming that a main pipe had burst and flooded their apartment. I knew instantly that a woman like Brenda does not check into her mother-in-law's modest spare bedroom over a minor plumbing issue, when she could easily stay at a high-end hotel. But I smiled warmly and welcomed them in any way because I needed her where I could see her. I did not sleep a wink that night. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard the third step from the bottom of the wooden staircase groan softly. I lay quietly in the dark, listening to her light footsteps cross the hallway toward my private study, stepping softly to the crack of my bedroom door. I watched Brenda kneeling on the hardwood floor in front of my fireproof filing cabinet. She had a small pen light gripped between her teeth and was working a pair of thin metal tools into the lock like she had watched a tutorial online. She was not a professional criminal. She was simply a desperate person running out of time and options. I allowed her to successfully pop the lock and pull the drawer open before I reached over and flipped the hallway light switch on. She gasped loudly and spun around, her face instantly going pale as she got caught red-handed in the bright beam of the light. I kept my voice mild, raspy, and thoroughly confused, asking her what on earth she was doing crawling around in the dark study at 2 in the morning. Brenda recovered remarkably fast, placing a hand over her heart and taking a dramatic breath as she claimed she had gotten lost while searching for a glass of water in the unfamiliar house. I pointed her toward the kitchen in a gentle tone and watched her hurry back upstairs. When I inspected the cabinet drawer, I found my property folder sticking out slightly from the rest of the papers, confirming precisely what she had been hunting for. First thing, the next morning, I reached out to a private investigator named Marcus, whom I had hired years ago during a commercial contract dispute. 3 days later, Marcus met me at a booth in the corner of a quiet diner near the docks, sliding a thick paper file across the laminate table. He looked at me with tired eyes and told me that my suspicions were entirely accurate. Brenda's consulting business was almost completely fake, sustained by rented cars and staged photo shoots to sell online courses to gullible followers, while her actual income was non-existent. Marcus explained that she had maxed out 6 different high-interest credit cards to maintain her lavish online image. But the real disaster had happened 2 years prior. She had taken her entire savings, along with a massive sum borrowed from private lenders, and invested it into an offshore trading platform that turned out to be a total fraudulent scam, losing every single penny in less than 48 hours. When commercial banks refused to loan her another dime, she turned to an aggressive private lender operating out of the city's east side. And she currently owed nearly $200,000 to people who do not use courtroom lawyers to collect their debts. My blood ran cold as Marcus slid another paper across the table, showing documented records that Brenda had been systematically transferring small sums of money out of my son's business account for over 10 months. She was disguising the theft as routine vendor supply fees, which was the direct reason my son's delivery van payments had been bouncing. If her draining of his account continued for another few months, Leo's business would be completely bankrupt and forced into liquidation. A cold, sharp clarity settled over me. The same quiet focus I used to feel when diagnosing a completely wrecked boat engine. She was actively destroying my son's life, putting his financial future in mortal danger, and looking him in the eye every morning with a smile. Marcus asked if I wanted him to hand the evidence over to local law enforcement, but I firmly shook my head. I knew that if the police arrested her now without a dramatic, undeniable revelation, my naive son would convince himself it was all a huge misunderstanding. He would sell his own shop to pay her legal fees and listen to her excuses through a glass partition. I needed Leo to witness her true nature with his own eyes and ears so that no amount of manipulation could ever rewrite the truth. That very afternoon, I went back to the marine shop and sat down with Roy in his office. I instructed him to help me create a fake, highly convincing inventory manifest for the North Storage Building. I wanted the document to list valuable items that would prove irresistible to a desperate thief looking for a quick score. Roy and I spent 2 hours putting together a official-looking ledger listing high-end, untraceable marine navigation hardware and commercial sonar equipment, allegedly recovered from decommissioned military vessels, valuing the contents at over $400,000. I stamped the folder with red ink, marked it as unrecorded surplus, and slid it deep into the same cabinet drawer Brenda had already picked open. Then had 3 tiny concealed security cameras installed inside my study, hidden seamlessly inside a smoke detector, a digital clock, and a wall outlet charger, with every camera angle trained directly on that filing cabinet. That evening at dinner, Brenda was practically vibrating with tense, nervous energy, her leg bouncing continuously under the dining table. Just as I anticipated, around midnight the hallway floorboard creaked once again. I sat up in my dark bedroom and watched the live video feed on my smartphone as Brenda crept into the study, pulled the marked folder from the drawer, and scanned the fake manifest with her mouth hanging open in shock. She took rapid photos of every single page with her cell phone before quietly sneaking back to her room. The following morning, while Brenda was taking a long shower upstairs, I slipped a tiny audio receiver deep inside the interior lining of her designer handbag. Sitting in my truck, 2 blocks away, later that afternoon, I listened through my headphones as she placed a frantic call to her aggressive lender. Her voice was high-pitched and trembling with artificial confidence as she told the man named Sal that she had found something vastly more valuable than her husband's tiny tackle shop. She told him about a private warehouse belonging to her mother-in-law that held $400,000 worth of unregistered, unrecorded marine electronics, sitting completely uninsured and The man on the other end of the line responded in a low, terrifyingly calm voice, reminding her that she had promised him quick money before and warning her that her time was up. Brenda frantically assured him that the opportunity was legitimate, claiming she had personally reviewed the physical inventory records and offering to provide the exact gate codes and building entry access. She urged him to send a crew with a flatbed truck to strip the entire facility clean in the middle of the night so he could take his cut and let her disappear with the rest. When the lender asked what would happen to her husband when the property went missing, Brenda did not hesitate for even a second. She coldly stated that Leo would never figure out she was involved, remarking that he was far too simple-minded to suspect anything, and adding that she was planning to abandon him in this dead-end coastal town the moment the cash cleared anyway. I sat in the quiet cab of my truck with a heavy weight in my chest, watching the harbor water ripple in the distance. She was not just stealing from an old woman's business. She was fully prepared to let armed criminals invade our family property, frame her own husband for negligence, and ruin his life without a single shred of guilt. Any tiny flicker of mercy I might have harbored for her completely vanished into at exact moment. What Brenda and her hired criminals did not know was that our North Storage building had not held spare engine parts or private inventory for over 5 years. 3 years ago, the Regional Maritime Authority had approached me seeking an isolated, highly secure waterfront site to support federal coastal operations. I had leased the North Building and the surrounding acre to them to serve as an official staging location for Maritime Interdiction Unit. From the outside, it retained its old, weathered look with rusted corrugated siding and heavy padlock chains, which was precisely why the agency loved the location. On the inside, however, the facility was outfitted with motion sensors, silent thermal alarms, and direct emergency lines connected directly to the local Coast Guard station and federal task force dispatchers. Furthermore, the site was actively monitored by armed security personnel who kept watch over sensitive government equipment around the clock. I gave Brenda the exact 5 days her dangerous lender had demanded. On the final evening, I asked my son to take a drive with me down to the marina, telling him I needed help checking a loose dock line before the night tide came in. He came along without question, chatting pleasantly about his plans for the upcoming fishing season. We pulled into an unlit parking lot directly across the water from the North Storage building, and I pulled out my laptop computer, opening a live video stream that connected to the hidden audio feed in Brenda's purse and the security cameras surrounding the marina property. I turned to my son and told him the entire, unvarnished truth without softening a single detail. I told him about Brenda's massive personal debts, her failed investments, the money she had been quietly stealing from his business checking account, and the fake manifest I had planted to catch her. Leo sat in the passenger seat of my truck as pale as a bedsheet, his jaw working silently as he tried to find words to defend the woman he loved. I placed my hand firmly over his shaking knuckles and told him to just keep his eyes on the screen, because he was about to see the reality of the situation for himself. At 9:45, headlight beams swept across the dark access road near the storage yard. A dark flatbed truck and a sedan pulled quietly up to the chain-link gate, and 3 people stepped out into the dim light. 2 of the men carried heavy tools, while Brenda walked right alongside them wearing a dark hoodie, holding a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters she had clearly bought for the occasion. My son let out a choked, ragged gasp beside me, a sound of absolute heartbreak that tore right through my soul. Through the audio feed, we heard Brenda's voice clearly as she pointed at the heavy brass locks on the main door, telling the hired locksmith that the old woman was completely clueless and that nobody ever checked this end of the property at night. The locksmith went to work, cutting through the thick steel chains, and within 3 minutes, the heavy metal door of the North Building was forced open. Brenda stepped inside first, waving her flashlight around the vast, dark interior, fully expecting to see rows of valuable electronic crates waiting to be loaded onto the flatbed. Instead, the moment her boots crossed the threshold, massive overhead floodlights snapped on automatically, illuminating the high concrete walls and blinding everyone inside. Standing right in the center of the room was a full squad of armed federal officers and harbor patrol agents, their weapons drawn and trained directly on the intruders. Brenda dropped the flashlight she was holding, her hands flying into the air as she let out a piercing shriek of absolute terror. The men she had hired immediately dropped their tools and threw themselves onto the cold concrete floor, while the officers moved in fast, forcing Brenda to her knees and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. Through the glass window of my truck, my son watched the entire scene unfold in crystal clarity, watching his wife sob and scream excuses as she was dragged toward the back of a law enforcement cruiser. I looked over at Leo, whose eyes were filled with tears. But behind those tears was a sudden, clear sense of reality that had finally broken through months of blind trust. He realized in that agonizing moment that the person he had brought into his life was a stranger who would have happily sacrificed him to save herself. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders and held him tight, feeling the heavy burden of the past 3 months finally lift off my chest. Brenda was formally charged with commercial burglary, grand larceny, and conspiracy, while the detailed financial records Marcus gathered were handed over to the state prosecutor, ensuring she would face full accountability for the money she had stolen from my son's business. In the weeks that followed, Leo and I worked side by side to clean up his shop accounts, rebuilding what she had tried to tear down. It took a long time for the emotional wounds to heal, but my son learned a lesson that will stay with him for the rest of his life. True family protects you, stands by you, and builds with you, while greed will cut every lock in sight just to steal the foundation right out from under your feet.